Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a fantastic panel. In fact, several people have already commented on what a stellar cast we have to talk about the budget this morning. I'm going to start as chair with asking just a few questions. We're not going to do opening statements. We're going to go straight into what does it mean. Please do think of your own questions. I'm sure you already are coming in with some, but obviously also if someone says something and you feel like it's either not quite clear or you disagree or you want to challenge or you just want a bit more information, then please do stick your hand up when we get to that point, and I will try and put as many questions to the panel as possible. We decided to hold the event now, so what are we, a week? Exactly a week, just under a week from the budget, because normally with budgets, by this point, there's been numerous things that have been uncovered, lots of small print, things have started to unravel, and there's a bit of chaos. But I'm going to sort of cautiously say that doesn't seem to have happened in the same way that we've had, maybe excepting the last budget, which we perhaps put down as a bit of a blip, but at least even the several before that, certainly we haven't had omni-shambles or anything like that. But that doesn't mean there isn't an awful lot we can still pour over. It doesn't mean that we can't get into some of the nitty-gritty of what some of the announcements or lack of announcements mean. So I'm not going to do broad intros. I will just literally tell you who you have, as you all will be very familiar with the set of people. Delighted to have Richard Hughes, obviously chair of the OBR. So responsible for deciding whether the budget does look fiscally sensible and adds up. Is that fair?
Or meets the Chancellor's definition of fiscally sensible.
Okay, there we go. Well, see, first question already. We're diving straight in. Brilliant stuff. Thank you. But also formerly of the Treasury, and I think you did lead a spending review.
I did back in 2008.
So you've been on both sides, which hopefully brings a little more depth to that analysis. Obviously, Meg Hillier, who as well as the most important role being on our Reform Advisory Board, which we're delighted by, is also a very familiar face to everyone as chair of the Public Accounts Committee and has been on PAC, I think, for over a decade, if I'm right, and chair since 2015, so has seen many budgets and spending reviews and emergency budgets and et cetera, in terms of fiscal events. So brilliant to have Meg with us as well this morning, and then Ed Conway, who you will all again be very familiar with, who is on your TV all of the time. And if you're not following on Twitter, you definitely should, particularly the recent threads on the banking or current potential banking crisis or credit. Yeah. Not sure what I can call it at the moment, but fascinating stuff. And also writes, of course, for the regular column for the Times. So a real expert group of people this morning. I'm gonna dive straight in, and Richard, I wanted to come to you first, if I may. So this was billed, obviously, as the back to work budget, and everybody will be very familiar with the challenges around economic inactivity, the pressures in the labour market, the volume of vacancies, etc. So we were told that this budget was going to get all those who'd exited back into the labour force, and obviously that will have hopefully an impact on growth. And I want to ask, I suppose, firstly, the numbers going back by these measures, given the price tag on some of these measures, the numbers going back aren't huge, about 15,000 for £1 billion of pension money, child care, which obviously was many billions, I think is about 75,000. How do you come up with, how do you validate those behavioural assumptions? And would you have expected to have seen more labour market bang for the bucks going in?
Yeah, thanks, and very good question. So I should say at the outset, when we look at the government's policy package and then think about its economic impact, we always take account of its demand side implications, meaning is the government either adding or taking away from the disposable income of households or the profit margins of businesses, and in doing so, is that going to change their consumption behaviour or is it going to change their investment behaviour? But that effect is always temporary, because we assume that if the government's injecting excess demand into the system, the Bank of England through monetary policy sort of takes it out by the time we get to the end of the forecast period. What we also do is also assess whether we think any of the policy measures in the budget have an effect on the supply side of the economy as well, which can be more durable, because if you get more people into the labour market, presumably they stay there, and that adds the supply potential of the economy. And when we talk about the supply side of the economy, we mean basically, are you adding to the stock of labour out there in the workforce? Are you adding to the stock of capital, so how much businesses invest, or are you making a difference to the wider productivity economy? In this budget, most of the impact that's on the supply side that the policy measures announced had were on employment. We think that overall, the net effect of all the policies announced on the employment side in the budget added about 110,000 people to the workforce. As you said, most of the impact came from getting more parents of young children back into work through having access to free childcare. There was also a sort of further effect from the fact that parents who are already working might work longer hours because they get some of their childcare now paid for and they can afford to purchase more childcare as a result. So there's both a sort of what we call an intensive margin and an extensive margin effect. And you get some people into the labour force because they can now afford childcare, and some people working longer hours because they can afford more childcare. We had some smaller effects from the pensions changes, and then also some small effects from the reforms to inactive benefits and other changes to the benefits system. In terms of how we calibrate those, I mean, what we basically look for are these policy measures acting on a set of barriers to people either going into employment or increasing their hours. And when you looked at the distribution of employment rates by the age of children, it was pretty obvious that once you get to 3 and 4, employment rates jump up. But actually there's sort of financial barrier to people with younger children from actually getting back into the workforce. And so we thought this measure was going to make a difference. On the pension side, there was a similar kind of bunching of people just around the lifetime allowance, just ahead of the lifetime allowance, and you saw sort of dip in the employment rates of people with large pension pots as they approach that allowance, which basically looks a lot like an incentive effect of people saying, look, it doesn't make sense to keep working if I'm going to hit this sudden financial penalty. So these two reforms, the childcare reform, extends to a group of parents with younger children the same kind of incentives that you now have for parents of older children. And the reforms of the pensions allowance kind of basically irons out what was something which was causing what you might think was being a distortion in the employment choices of people as they get close to that tax barrier. On the inactivity side, you're working on just a much harder and more difficult issue, where you've got multiple barriers to getting back into work, some of which are health related, some of which are financial, and so in that sense, it was an area where we looked around and there was a bit of evidence for some things making a difference based on experience here in the UK and the outside world, and then a lot of things which are definitely worth trying, but don't have a demonstrated track record of getting significant numbers of people back into work, and so for that reason, we will keep looking at this area. We'll watch how these policies whether they are successful or not, but it wouldn't be sensible to take a chance on the fact that they might work and assume you're going to get a big employment return from that.
So an absence of evidence rather than evidence that it won't work when it comes to some of those welfare changes.
Yeah.
And just as a very quick follow-up, I think we calculated in part of looking at the small print, I'm sure everyone signed up for our snap analysis that we put out, that about 26 billion are going into these back to work measures over the forecast period to get us precisely back to the same participation rate in 2027-28, which I think is 63% as it is today. And some might say that's quite a large injection of cash for not shifting labour market participation at all. Would you have a response to that?
So I think it's certainly 110,000 you have to compare against. We think we've lost around 500,000 since the pandemic, from a whole host of reasons, which include people deciding to take early retirement because some of them managed to save some money during the pandemic, reach their sort of target level of savings. Those people are going to be very hard to get back into the labour force because they've made a lifestyle choice. They've got the resources they need to support themselves. So I don't think it would ever have been realistic to think you're going to get all those people back into the labour force. I think another thing which is interesting about the policies chosen in this budget was that they were a set of solutions which were not necessarily acting on the source of the problem. But they were acting more where there was a track record of success in this country, which is actually we've been reasonably good at getting younger parents back into the workforce. And this is kind of doubling down on that success rather than trying to change the minds of a set of people who decided to leave, namely older workers who are approaching retirement.
Thank you. And Meg, I wanted to ask you about more broadly the kind of, and I want to come back to the comment about fiscal rules, and I particularly, Ed, want to pick up with you on that. But the public spending envelopes, and quite a few people commented on there was nothing in terms of some of perhaps the what we know is a big inflation impact on departmental envelopes. Obviously, lots of debate about where any pay settlements are going to come from in that funding as well. It all looks very, very pressured, and obviously particularly post a general election. I just wondered, in terms of your view, particularly in the context of obviously chairing PAC, around a lot of expectation on efficiency to mean that public spending is going to still deliver decent public services here, and we even had a new efficiency framework we're being promised. What is your view and the PAC view of that, and how doable?
Well, we're quite cynical about the word efficiency is bandied around, and it is a bit of the holy grail. And very often, you always be suspicious of a politician who says, I'm announcing a new policy and it will pay for about efficiency savings this year, because you can never get efficiency savings this year, even in the next financial year very often. And you're right about pay. Just to touch on that, we actually raised that with the Permanent Secretary at Health and Social Care yesterday. We were talking about the departmental accounts. Where's the money going to come from? So he had his very Mandarin answer. We're in discussions with the Treasury. But it is not all going to come from the Treasury, we're pretty clear, so it's going to be very difficult. And you've also got, in some departments like defence, some hedging of foreign exchange over 3 years, those things, construction costs. So any department that's dealing with those is seeing a huge uplift in their costs, but not in their budget. And the defence money that's been announced, not all of it is entirely new, but also it's about replenishing stocks. It's not actually increasing capability or dealing with some of the big knotty issues that are there. So it is going to be very tight for departments, very difficult. But the efficiency framework is important. Everybody wants a bit of a National Audit Office. Every government or opposition wants National Audit Office to give them an imprint, to say that they're fine, it's all great. But actually in this case, there has been an arrangement between the government and the National Audit Office. That the agreement is, of course, I should stress that the Controller and Auditor General, who heads the National Audit Office, is fully independent, has letters patent and now from the King. I don't know if he's got new ones since Her Majesty died, but he makes his own decisions. So, but there is a methodology that they've worked up to say that we can give some assurance. But actually, that's what the NEO does anyway. All those value for money studies, all of the lessons learned. And if you're interested in this, look at some of the work they've done on cross-cutting issues across government and anatomies of departments, because in that you can see some of the lessons that I have seen, as you say, over a decade on the committee. It is a bit, in fact, I bumped into the former CNAG on the way this morning, and we were saying that it's a bit depressing, isn't it, that the same old things come around again and again and again. So just beware the word efficiency, because it often isn't what it seems, but the Chancellor is genuinely trying to do something here, but realistically, it's often, all it takes is one other big political announcement and it's paid for on efficiencies and you bust everything anyway. So even if you've got it well worked up, it just takes one more announcement.
And one small sort of follow-up question, but we also had announced, Devo turbocharged, if I can call it that, in terms of these single budgets, almost like departmental budgets that are going to be given to West Mids and to Greater Manchester. And from a PAC perspective, in terms of scrutinising expenditure and understanding whether there's value for money and how effective, what does that look like, and what would be your view of how the accountability for that funding should look?
Really interesting question. When all these new mayors were elected, I met them all one by one, Tees Valley, the two Andys, and said you need to set up now really good local audit arrangements, because you want to prove that you're spending the voters the money well, and you should just make that an absolute plank of what you're doing, so that you get their confidence and they want to get re-elected, of course. But you also may need to prove to government that you haven't got enough to do what they gave you for. So if they're given health in Manchester, they've done some great things, but who's going to arbitrate when the government says, well, we've given you the money, it's over to you now, and then the devolved authority says, well, actually, it's not enough to do what you've said we should be doing with it. So there does need to be something there, and I think there's a real opportunity. It's interesting that we have my party leader talking about devolution as well. So I think turbocharge is probably the word politically across. From what we heard last week and from Labour or whoever, it's now much more discussed. We've had particularly two effective mayors in Manchester and the West Midlands who have got a voice and spoken up for, others too, but they're the ones that I guess we would highlight. And we need to think about better audit arrangements. As it happens, you have combined authorities, and then you'll have a monitoring officer from one of those authorities who's responsible for the propriety of spending and so on. And you have an audit arrangement, an audit committee, but it's not very strong. And people sometimes have talked, the Centre for Public Scrutiny talked about public accounts committees for every local authority. Realistically, very difficult to do, but to resource it. But you do need some better resource.
Would you want to see them being called in front of PAC?
Well, I think that would be tricky, because I think we wouldn't be able to reach that wide, and also nor would the National Audit Office have reach in. So you're going to have local audit arrangements for the combined authorities. I'm very convinced of that now.
Okay.
And you couldn't do it for every individual district council, but for the combined authorities you need much better audit arrangements. But I put just a warning note out there that we've been looking a lot at local government audit. There are some councils that haven't had 2 years of their accounts signed off. Even some hospitals that currently haven't got auditors appointed for this financial year. It hasn't crept too badly into the hospital sector yet, but it's very drastically, it's chaotic actually, and really very bad in the local government sector. So councillors and officers are making decisions without an audit opinion from previous year, and with over 10% haven't actually been completed for this year. It's not, and the audit market is broken, but they just about got over the line in local government councils last time, but it's a real problem. So where you find all of these people is my point. You know? So in Manchester or West Midlands, where are you going to get a group of people who could be on the audit committee? Just getting people on the audit committee is hard, but to have the right audit capability and capacity with the big four, you know, they've been an attempt to bring in 2 smaller firms to build them up to take on more public audit, but we're losing good public auditors. We don't have a really strong base. So that's if you've got children, encourage them to go. It's going to be quite a lot of money in it.
So
is that a funding thing though? Is that
no, it's part. Well, it's part in that. Well, so a very quick summary of the history. Audit fees were driven down, and so the Audit Commission was abolished properly in 2014. There was a lot of discussion around it in 2012. So basically, 2014 there was no Audit Commission. So it went to the private companies. So the public auditors from the Audit Commission went there, but they had to build up their public audit part of their company. And we're quite suspicious as a committee. Think, well, there's much more money in private audit, and if you've got private and public clients, where would you put your resource? But then local authorities drove the fees down, with some councils saying, well, why are we paying all these people all this money? You can imagine we want to spend it on a library or a school or whatever. And so that didn't help. So that drove more people out of the market. And then you've got this cohort of very good public auditors able to make that judgment. In fact, one promising sign is that in Bournemouth, the auditor wrote a letter and then the leader resigned. But we've seen things collapse in Croydon, before that point. So that is a sign that maybe the system's working a bit more. But it's quite something for an auditor to say, to put out an opinion, and that brings the commissioners in potentially to a local authority, and they've got a different set of judgments that they're dealing with a company. So we could do a whole session on public audit,
we
but
won't do a
probably
whole
won't do
session
that
on auditing, but yes. Thank you so much. And Ed, I want to come back to the point that Rich very delicately alluded to, which is the fiscal rules, and do we class what we've got as good fiscal rules or not? And I will come back and ask you that question as you teed it up so nicely, but I'll let you think of your independent answer. But I just wanted, obviously the fiscal rule in terms of debt falling by the final forecast, and so what we've seen is it increasing every single year until that final year where we get a 0.2% drop in the public sector debt, which just about ticks the fiscal rule box. And we were told by the Chancellor to, kind of great fanfare, that there was a 6.5 billion buffer built in, which I think by the time he stood up, you guys had said, no, that's just disappeared because of interest rate changes. So I just wanted to ask, was this a fiscally responsible budget? And are the fiscal rules fit for purpose?
Well, I mean, it was. So when we were kind of covering it, as journalists tend to, there was a lot of comments in the office about it's a bit boring, isn't it, this one? And I think partly that's because we've kind of become acclimatised to these astonishing, massive fiscal stimuli. The mini budget last year was certainly not unexciting in terms of the what happened afterwards, and in it as well. And yet, so this felt like kind of the first normal budget for a while, but I think that disguised the fact that it was quite a big splurge, at least in the initial 3 years of the horizon, and then kind of retrenching. Basically, it looks like just because of the fiscal rules, and I think that kind of gets to your point, Charlotte. It's like if the fiscal rules are causing you to contort this policy to the extent that you're having to say to people, we really do want to have full expensing forever for the long run, but we're not able to do it for more than 3 years, then it's just, the question is, what kind of a message does that send to businesses, who want to invest? Full expensing, I mean, my feeling about full expensing is it's potentially a really, really big deal, and maybe a bigger deal than most people kind of presume, and I feel that partly the reason that people are a bit like, oh, it's kind of great, but not as good as the super deduction, because they see the super deduction is 130%, they see full expensing as it's not. But what I think you've got to kind of take into account is that the super deduction was happening at the very moment of the UK raising corporation tax, by a lot, actually by kind of 30%. And the super deduction was kind of in part designed to prevent people from forestalling with their investment ahead of the rise in corporation tax. Now, it strikes me at least, with corporation tax kind of, high, but stable potentially, a full expensing environment is kind of potentially much more stimulatory. And I mean, the question which, as Richard was saying, so the OBR does look at certain supply side reforms and takes a view on particularly on the kind of employment side here, but there is another view that it might well be that full expensing encourages lots of businesses to invest more in plant, in machinery, and in various different things they've been waiting for a while. And as a result of that, you get a bit of a productivity bump. But I mean, I know the OBR is a bit nervous about kind of, going for big product changes to the productivity forecasts as a result of these reforms. So all of which is kind of, a long-winded way of saying, I think it was actually quite significant. And I think some of the measures, were quite expensive. And the great irony is, because we were kind of accustomed, well, not accustomed, it's the wrong word, but because the last big fiscal event that everyone remembers was the mini budget, where there was this extraordinary response from markets. This time, the Chancellor had the smallest amount of leeway against the fiscal rules, and if you looked at previous fiscal rules, it would have been, even smaller and kind of breaking various of George Osborne's fiscal rules. So, theoretically, this was the riskiest in fiscal terms budget that we've seen in a long time. And Jeremy Hunt's the riskiest Chancellor, and yet because everyone looks at him and says, you are not a risky Chancellor, and because everyone knows what happened previously, and because they look at the market, and obviously the other thing perhaps we'll come back to is the great irony is there has been a big market event recently, and part of the reason, I do wonder to some extent whether part of the reason that more landmines or hand grenades are not being exposed from this budget might be because the entire financial press is now focused on what's happened with Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse and all of that. But yeah, it was actually quite an interesting, quite a big budget, and actually more interesting than a lot of people gave it credit for. And the question I suppose now is, what is the gamble for the government if they are that close to to hitting those fiscal rules? What are they hoping for to be able to do that kind of pre-election tax cut, which just seems almost inevitable? Is it that there is a kind of big boost in growth thanks to the super deduction, which hasn't really been fully costed by, fully kind of predicted by the OBR forecast? I don't really know, but there has to be something. And I think I get the impression from people in the Treasury that they're quite hopeful about supply side boost. But then again, they always say that, don't they? So I mean,
I don't know. I find the Treasury generally quite miserable, aren't they?
Yeah, no,
not
true.
very optimistic at all.
It's true, but they have to hope for it in order to to have that kind of envelope for the next autumn statement and the budget, which everyone assumes will include some pretty big giveaways
before
an election. Exactly.
I want to come back briefly before I do open it up to questions to the growth question and was there enough in it. But just very briefly to each of you, I mean, we've sort of, I think, heard scepticism about the fiscal rules. Certainly, I'm not going to put that. I'm not going to put those words into your mouth. But you raised the question of whether we think they're sensible fiscal rules, and obviously, Ed, you've just pointed out the distortions it creates, and Meg, you seem to be nodding there.
I think when you've got the IFS saying we don't really think these, come on, these rules are silly, then you're in a bit of a crazy place.
If the IFS come out saying anything like that, you're in a bad place. So very, very briefly, should we have fiscal rules if actually all they do is distort behaviours in a way that is actually unhelpful? So really briefly.
So I think I wouldn't have taken this job if I didn't believe that rules matter, and the assessing whether they're being met is important. And I guess if you think of the analogy with a company, would you invest in a company that didn't have a financial objective to get into profit at some point? No. And as taxpayers, should we be paying taxes to a government that doesn't have a plan for managing those revenues responsibly? I think the answer is also no. I think it's also telling that we were one of the first countries to introduce fiscal rules back in the late 90s, and since then they've spread pretty much all around the world because people just see the value they have in signalling your financial intentions, and in particular maintaining the support and confidence of markets. And
they've changed though quite frequently over that period. It's
Yeah.
sort of
They
an
have.
ever-moving target.
They have, but I guess in defence of the people who've set them, the world has changed a lot in the
Very
meantime as
fair.
well. And so sticking to your plans in the face of a pandemic or an energy crisis is probably the wrong choice. But it is the case that we've certainly had more rules in this country than almost any other, and a bit less innovation and a bit less steady progress would be
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, I think they matter because you want stability and you want confidence, but that's why if you change them, it has to be because of big events,
Yeah.
not just for cheap political reasons. And I hate budgets because I believe I commend you the whole of government accounts. If you want to see what's really going on with your taxes, look at that document, which we work on with the Treasury come and talk to us about it every year. Well, it's now a bit behind, and much further behind it should be because of the pandemic, sadly, but it is a really useful document because that's really where you see the whole picture of spending and the patterns and changes and the liabilities that are there for government. Because budgets, well, the problem is with fiscal rules that a chancellor can change them for political reasons.
Yeah.
And when the longer range you go out, you can always predict it's going to meet your fiscal rule 4 years away, because you're not really going to be around then usually as a chancellor to deal with the problem. She says cynically, but there you go. That's the problem with politicians, where we come and we go.
That is true. Ed?
Well, I have to be contrarian, don't I think we should get rid of them. I think no fiscal rules. And I, but there is a serious point there, which is that, where is credibility bound up? We have fiscal rules. The first it was Gordon Brown and the Golden Rule. Okay, so Gordon Brown wanted to enshrine the rules. He wanted to show that Labour was serious about the public finances. It was a bit of a novelty, but I feel like that was part of his effort to show that he was credible as a chancellor. I think credibility is bound up in politicians and their fiscal plans, and discipline is provided for the most part, I think, by the market. And what did we learn last year? Okay, yes, Kwasi got rid of the fiscal rules, but he got rid of an extraordinary amount of other things at the same time. The fiscal plans themselves were pretty extraordinary. The vibe, around the Treasury at that point was kind of extraordinary. I don't think fiscal rules were the biggest part of that.
Maybe the OBRs.
What they did with the
actually.
OBRs, so it was the way that they treated institutions and other things. I think that in the hierarchy, I think fiscal rules came quite a long way down. So to me, it's just a little, it's a kind of embellishment of what is a fundamental, credibility.
But one of the things about fiscal rules that's helpful for a politician is if you're having to hold off, like Rachel Reeves will be at the moment, every Labour backbencher and frontbencher trying to promise everything, you've got to fit the fiscal rules. It just puts a constraint around cheap promises.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I do want to ask about growth. I'm going to come to questions in about, whenever we've finished the answers to this question. So please do think about what you would like to ask our fabulous panel. But just on the growth point, so Ed, you talked about the kind of shift from super deduction to the full expensing. And the sort of uncertainty around that. I think there's an interesting question around whether only allowing it for kind of physical infrastructure. I mean, you can't do it for human capital, for example, and there are huge shortages in investment in skills, which, thinking about labour market and participation rates and productivity, should we, even though we've kind of got to the point where we really recognise that skills are probably one of the most important factors, you can't expense the human capital investment. So sort of that's, I guess, a question for the panel. But also, we did actually see some, what we certainly at Reform thought was some really quite promising stuff around science and tech and life sciences. So some of the regulatory reforms to the MHRA, the medicines regulator, which is very positive, I think, and some of the stuff around the quantum computing and the other very technical terms that I'm not very good at, so I won't attempt to say them out loud. But some of that kind of innovation investment did look quite good. And again, I guess to all the panel, optimistic about. Ed, maybe come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, for me, overshadowing all of this is the fact that I don't think any government for a long time has grasped with the fact, or grappled with the fact that we in this country, and there was an interesting paper on this recently, Anna Stansbury, Ed Balls, that the UK has deindustrialised faster than any other country in the world, save maybe for some former Soviet states. I was looking at steel output again. People are sniffy about steel, and I guess that's just the way we are in this country. But I think that tells you rather a lot as well. And there is no other country in the world, save for Venezuela, which has seen steel production fall as much as in this country. No other country in the world. And given that manufacturing typically, in the way that we measure it, tends to be the kind of, to have seen the higher gains in productivity over the course of the last few decades. I think that maybe there is not a coincidence that we are struggling with a productivity crisis right now, and at the same time, more perhaps than other countries. I think it's overdone the extent to which the UK is an outlier. We're not really an outlier, but we are certainly at the one end of that, and also have deindustrialised faster than pretty much every other every other major economy, save for former Soviet states. And I think we're beginning to see a response to that. And so for me, actually, the fact that the full expensing is primarily on kind of physical plant machinery, I'm slightly less bothered, not that I'm not bothered about kind of human capital as well, but I think that if there's one area where we are quite deficient and one area where we could benefit from more investment, it is in our, in manufacturing physical stuff. We are incredibly good at it in this country, but we are incredibly good having kind of tightened our manufacturing base extraordinarily and facing the highest energy costs in the developed world, which is extraordinary for manufacturers. And right now, there is an industrial revolution happening where the US is throwing money at people to come to America to build gigafactories and wind turbines and whatever it is, whereas we just don't really have a response to it yet. I think the government is kind of getting there, and there's been a big shift in mindset, but we've had decades of thinking this stuff didn't matter, decades, and I think it's profoundly important that we are now, I think, potentially reaping consequences of that, and maybe, I hope the government is starting to realise that.
No.
Yeah, and I think that it's difficult to catch up on some of that big stuff, and of course, I mean, a lot of companies are looking at America, and it's much easier to go to America with what they're doing with their COVID recovery stuff. I think for science and tech, though, are real opportunities, and I think that hopefully what we've heard will turn into real results on the ground, because they're very portable businesses too. Of course, that is the problem. And you see across Europe, how Ireland used to have a lot of tech companies and still has, but when Poland was in the EU, so a lot of people moved over. They could build sort of cheap warehouses for manufacturing or sort of high-level tech manufacturing, and then shift it overnight pretty much because it was cheap to do. So I think we've got to make sure that the whole environment works, and then there's a challenge of being out of Europe. So how the collaboration works, because that will also appeal to a lot of companies and scientists. But I think there's a real opportunity for us there. And I always felt, when I remember visiting Cammell Laird a number of years, just over a decade ago, and they were saying that we build chips, we could build wind turbines, and if you could combine the tech sector and Shoreditch, say, just I would say Shoreditch, but the tech sector in Shoreditch with some of the newer, greener technologies that we need to see and we need to ramp up, you could have the absolute perfect. You've got the perfect crucible here in the UK. Plus, we've got all the natural resources to deal with some of the green technologies, wind, tide, the weather basically, and the coastline. So I think we are so behind. And I shadowed this kind of portfolio in the Shadow Cabinet in 2010-11, and it's really depressing the little progress we've made. So, I want to believe that this will work, because I'm always trying to be an optimist, even if it's not my own government doing it. But there's a long way to go. But we need consistency. So actually, we need not just Jeremy Hunt to be saying this, but we need to be listening to things that Rachel Reeves is already saying. I think they're sometimes talked about in the same sort of, so they've got the same sort of mindset, and they're both cautious, sensible, and stable, I think. And dare I say that about Conservative Chancellor? but compared with his predecessors, anyway.
Well, you used to be able to say that about Conservative Chancellor. That's sort of a flip period. Richard?
I guess just in terms of how we think about the growth impact of policies, one way to get more output is to just get more people into the labour force, and I talked about how we reflected that in our forecast. We didn't reflect anything long-term from the policies on the investment side and from full expensing, but basically because they were temporary. Had they been permanent, we do think they would have raised the level of investment permanently, and that they would have had a lasting effect on the size of the capital stock that people are working with. But because it was announced as a 3-year temporary policy, we just assumed that it brings forward investments into the years where you get the tax advantage, and then when you get the full whack of the 25% CT rate, investment then just goes back down. Had he made a different set of choices, he could have had a different consequence for decision making. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that what investors want is certainty about the regime as much as financial advantages of one sort or another. And it has been a hugely unstable environment in which to invest, partly for exogenous reasons, a pandemic and energy crisis, but also because the tax regime is constantly changing with temporary regimes that then turns, some of which last, some of which don't. So that sort of instability makes it harder to get any long-term benefit from a set of policy choices.
And just that human capital point?
So on human capital, I think two things are important to bear in mind. If you're talking about training people, and you're talking about training people in universities, most people in the workforce have already been trained, and so you're dealing with 30 plus million people who are already out there in the workforce. Bringing on new people with new skills will make a difference, but it'll make a difference in 10, 20 years as they work their way through the workforce. For the moment, you're dealing with the workforce who've got the skills they've got, unless that training is being focused on workplace training, which we're notoriously quite bad at.
Well, skills, we look at a lot of this obviously in the public sector mainly, but digital is a really big gap. We've often mentioned audit. There are financial skills. These are not, it's not rocket science what we need. And the private sector, cyber, if you go get your kids going to cyber, that's just so competitive. And yet we just don't have enough people. We could be at the cutting edge of that. So these are things that, though, again, stability, we need to make decisions that both parties basically agree that they keep investing.
And Richard, was there another point you were going to make back in?
I think just on the wider innovation point and about sort of developing and exploiting new ideas, I think you can spend a lot of money on these things and you can develop new ideas, but you then have to find the commercial and economic benefit from them. And we do have very good primary research, we have very good research and development, but it is equally possible that you can spend a lot of money on research and development in this country and the economic benefit happens in the United States because they buy up the intellectual property and they do the commercial exploitation because they've got the scale to do it there and they've got the resources to do it there.
We could also have a conversation, which we won't do, for another day about whether our universities are indeed equipping people for the labour market. I am going to open it up to questions. I already see hands going up. I'm going to take 3 in one go as we get through people. So, Gavin, I think your hand was up first. There's a lady just here in the middle, and then Julian behind. We'll take those 3 first.
Might be a bit of a clarification or a follow-up point. In terms of the human capital versus physical capital, you'd appreciate when we're 8 or 10, you've got a lot of choice. When you talk about training people, that's oftentimes just expensed anyway. So it is 100% coming off the P&L. So it's not really a thing. People are already doing it. And to the extent that you do have, something where you're investing for training for folk, that's a 2 or 3 year depreciation, if that. Even PCs, you buy PCs are probably in a couple of years. So the whole expensing it's there. I'm not really sure that it's a huge point. So it's more a point, but maybe just a clarification that unless I'm missing it.
Oh no, that's right.
Okay, that was very simple. Sorry, the lady in the middle.
This is mainly for Richard. So criticism I've heard both from people on the left and on the right is that the OBR is too cautious or unwilling to score the benefits of policies that increase growth or reduce the need for public spending. And this makes it more difficult to make the case for them, in particular because of the assumption that we'll return to 2% long-term trend growth regardless of what growth policies are followed. So just wondering what you make of that criticism.
Thank you. I'm going to take that, that's right. And then Julian.
Yeah, thank you. Julian McRae from Engage Britain. I spent quite a lot of time sitting in rooms with people, members of the public, who are really clear that there's underinvestment in a lot of our public services. That's the first point they'll come to. So I've always been fascinated by some of the numbers the OBR put out. Wonderful report. Chart 4.6, which is very coloured.
Our type of audience member there.
It shows that GDP, spending share GDP rises by, I think, 4.1% from 2019-20 through to the end of the forecast period, 27-28. Now, some of that rise is to do with debt interest increasing, but by no means all of it. I was just wondering what you make, and indeed, PSC, I'm sure, have looked at all of this, and obviously public debate is huge. What's happening that we're seeing this shift up in our spending share GDP, yet we're pretty convinced in the nation that our public services are dropping back and underinvested in?
Okay, thank you. So more money being spent, worse outcomes, I think is sort of the sense there. So shall we just very quick, was there anything else on, I think we probably covered the human capital, but anything else anyone wanted to add on that? No, perfect. So question specifically for you, Richard, on is the OBR, I'm going to sort of phrase it in harsher terms, is OBR part of the problem in terms of incentivising investment because you won't score the benefits?
Oh, I don't think so. I think the world is the problem.
Okay.
Which is and there's an important distinction between stocks and flows, which is that people think that the growth benefit you get comes from the flow of investment, or the flow of new trainees into the workforce. The growth benefit you get in the long run comes from the stocks.
Yeah.
What you have to work with is your workforce, your stock of capital, and your stock of ideas. The annual flow of things into that, be they people or be they new investment, is vanishingly small, and so even if you double them, you don't get much. The stock of capital in this country is 400% of GDP. Public investment is 2%. even if you double it, you're not making a huge difference to that stock. What you're working with is what the Victorians built for us in terms of rail lines, what the Romans built for us in terms of sewers. And so in that sense, you are working with an accumulated set of decisions over time. If you wait long enough, you can have big growth benefits from those things, as we've seen in this country and lots of other countries have seen. And we do in our forecasts, when governments make a permanent and deliberate, lasting difference to invest more, things say, one, that's going to raise the public sector capital stock, that increases the growth potential of the economy. But oftentimes it only does that after 10 or 20 years, because that's how you actually make a meaningful difference to something which is 400%.
Well, we could definitely have a long conversation about short-termism versus long-termism in government and whether that might actually move the dial. But again, probably for another day. So for everyone, then maybe Meg, starting with you, but this sense that actually we've never been, I mean, in peacetime, been spending more than we are in terms of public sector expenditure, and yet not just I think how people feel. If you look at most metrics in terms of outcomes, they are going in the wrong direction. And how do we reconcile that?
Well, I mean, obviously there are pressures like inflation, which are just squeezing budgets. So health got a bit more money additional at the last fiscal event, but we don't. And even the money that's going into defence is just being eaten up by existing things. So there's not really new. So you are seeing a contraction. Every department will be tightening its belt, and sometimes that. And then I mentioned I'm going to go on about the efficiency point again, but everyone talks about efficiency, but we talk a lot about the inputs, but not enough about the outputs, and that's a terrible disease of all public. Pretty much all public bodies actually that have had the privilege of seeing or working with, and our work shows that that we ask for you. So, for example, we're about to put out a report on DEFRA, but I'll give you the figures. It's something like £738 million to improve all of their digital services. The efficiency savings will be something like a billion, but it'll be about 20 billion a year or something. Once if they do it all. So even if you invest a lot to save, you're not going to get the returns. Sorry, I may have got the figures wrong, but our report's being launched soon, so you'll read it all there. we have about 2 reports a week, so my head's swimming in different data all the time. But I think, so we've got to, there's also a disease of government that the efficiencies is the one hand, but people chance to say we're going to put more money into something, and then the Treasury is always sceptical, of course, about putting more money in because it gets just eaten up in the black hole that is often in government departments, but often there are real needs in there. I remember, just a small point, but when I was a minister in the Home Office, I covered science, and when they were having a squeeze on the budget, they said we're going to cut the social science budget. And I said, you really, really can't cut the social science budget, but it's just an easy cut, they said. And the finance director wasn't really wanting to discuss it with me because I said, but ministers in 20 years' time will have a big gap in important data when they're trying to make policies, but this wasn't a consideration, which is why I believe in slow politics, but a system. I'm probably the wrong person to be in a political system.
But also believe in evaluation and evidence and collecting data.
Which you need to have. Evidence
Yeah.
needs to evaluate. You need all of those things which take a long time. Don't get me started on pensions because
We won't. We're going to come back to
because that is
and
really
that point about public services, and the IFS has been very clear about just how tight this looks for departments.
And I mean, actually, just to bounce off what Meg was saying, and far be it for me to talk about this with the chair of the Public Accounts Committee and the former Treasury expert as well, but the emphasis in Whitehall at the moment and the power structure in Whitehall doesn't seem to have changed at all. The Treasury is still all powerful. The Treasury's influence in terms of defeating anything or kind of suppressing anything that it doesn't particularly like the look of. It doesn't seem to me that has changed whatsoever, and I think that's another thing institutionally that we need to wrestle with if we're thinking about what kind of a government we want, because the Treasury view and the Treasury attitude is still all powerful, and the Treasury is into certain things and not into certain. It's not into manufacturing. It doesn't think much about energy. It is into certain other things, but it's those other
Mostly
things.
cost constraints.
I was going to say, yeah, that's basically the other things, exactly. And so one of the interesting things during the Tory leadership campaign was when Kevin Badenoch was talking about the question of having a kind of economy ministry. It's an old debate, but I think it is one we need to kind of talk about and revisit, because right now I see Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt as having an extraordinary amount of power and kind of quite a coalesced vision, whereas I just don't know how much authority or influence the rest of government has, and that's pretty important. Again, coming back to the fact that we're living in a period where we may be going through an industrial revolution right now, and the Treasury is kind of interested in spending cuts.
Yeah, I think just thinking about on that, take it, but we have still very siloed Whitehall, and yet the difficult issues that face our world are not in one department or another. You can sort out DEFRA's IT systems or Home Office's emergency services network or Police National Computer or build prisons. Those on their own don't solve the problems, and so we do need to do that. I know that my party's thinking about how to do this in government, but it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
And you don't want to also, no government's going to come in and start doing lots of machinery government changes to do that. So you have to have quite a lot of strong political will. And it's interesting talking to people about how they did delivery and how delivery units are created and then demolished and then created again. And we're not good at that cross-cutting delivery.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of political capital. Hazel Blears once tried it and got somewhere, but it kind of crumbled when she left, and she got different departments put bits of money in on local targets for place-based decisions and place-based outcomes. But I think she's a lot of blood, sweat and tears to get to
Yeah,
that. And it was a small bit of the whole of the Whitehall firm.
I was in DPP when we were trying to do troubled family stuff, and the sort of, to use the Tony Blair phrase, of scars on your back of trying to get money out of the other departments that would have reaped benefits had they put was just hellish. The sort of tends towards an argument of should we have more super departments rather than constantly breaking things up. So
you just get
you've
silos
got
within the
more of
departments.
that. Well, that's true. It's also very true. Luckily, in our Reimagining Whitehall programme, we will be considering these questions. So we will come with some answers. I'm going to kind of keep going. I know there was one right at the back. Is that Greg? It is. And then Dara and Stuart, I'll take. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Greg Rosen, segregate. Question, I suppose, to you all. Why would you say, given the importance that government placed and opposition and everyone in the budget on green investment, investment in infrastructure, matching Biden to an extent, and you talked about the infrastructure tax allowances. Why then is it, do we think, that the main rate of 18% that you're allowed to write off is specifically disallowed, not just for solar, but also for anything over 25 years, which includes most wind turbines now, when in theory, the whole part of the point of this is to facilitate and encourage investment in big green infrastructure.
Thank you. And then Dara?
Yeah, hi, Dara Singh from Newton. So we specialise in improving productivity in the public sector, and what I've learned much about is public sector productivity. I actually take your point, Meg, about efficiencies is a word that has been devalued over the years and is subject to lots of external forces. But public sector productivity is the holy grail of the issue that we haven't really solved over decades, and no party has. So interested in any observations on that. And Charlotte, your point about creating super departments at the centre, and Meg, your point about silos, I think actually the way you break down silos is at a local or a city region or a city level. Richard might question me on where my evidence is for that, but I fundamentally believe that, having seen Greater Manchester in particular as a combined authority working very effectively. So that whole question about accountability at a local level for how money is spent and what outcomes are achieved, how productive the system is laterally across health, local government, and so on, I think is really important. And do you think, particularly Meg, the Office for Local Government will have, what role should that new organisation play in trying to help us understand the value for money that we're getting out of investment?
Perfect, thank you. Stuart?
Hello, Stuart Carroll, Director Market Access Policy at Moderna, but I'm also doing a PhD and writing a paper actually with Reform at the moment on reimagining Whitehall. I couldn't agree with the points more about the Treasury and Whitehall, and I suppose my question is isn't there a massive, loud, noisy, smelly elephant in the room here, which is we can talk about budgets, we can talk about forecasts, we can talk about audits, but the real problem is the kind of quality of spend and where it's going or where it's not going. The accountancies, the Treasury, is a pretty good accountancy department. It's certainly not an economics department. I was in the vaccines task force, and some of the things we saw with the Treasury were just absolutely extraordinary, and actually government more generally. So don't we need to be thinking much bigger here, which is Whitehall basically doesn't work. There are lots of yes, talented people, but the leadership isn't there. And even if you look at the cabinet secretary down, it's it's an antiquated model. It was brought in 1916 for specific reasons to do with audit. So I'd like to get that sort of broader perspective on what your thoughts
Great.
are.
Thank you very much. So starting off then with essentially kind of the sort of green agenda, net zero, huge ambitions, but do we have a coherent kind of, set of incentives or kind of approach to it? Who would like to pick up that one?
Shall I
Yeah.
just pitch in, because I think you're right, Greg, that it doesn't on the face of it seem like that. I think it's partly because there's an assumption that it will happen anyway, because the world is getting greener and there are opportunities there. Can only assume that that's part of the reason for doing that, and on the exact economics of why they made those decisions at those particular points, I'm not really the best person to answer. But I think that we've seen that move. Though it is interesting, as I said, I shadowed this portfolio just over a decade ago, and we weren't seeing much investment then either. I think Rachel Reeves is hoping that her fund will be the thing that will help to trigger it, but obviously in opposition yet to see the detail of how that might actually reach the people who will need to be incentivised to do that.
Richard, can I ask you to pick up the public sector productivity question? And it does seem to have sort of slightly fallen off the discussion. I mean, actually, I don't think in departments. I mean, we did a session with Julian Kelly, the CFO of the NHS, who's rightly, thankfully, interested in productivity. But what are the opportunities here? I guess in terms of driving up that.
Yeah, and just to pick up on one point Meg made on the green agenda, I think it is the case that the government's revealed preference is to assume the market is going to solve a lot of these problems and rely on market signals. And I think if you think about getting to net zero, you've got three problems. One is transport, one is power, and one is buildings. Transport does appear to be solving itself, and that's actually creating a fiscal problem for governments because even though they don't index the rate very often, fuel duty, they still collect £30 billion of fuel duty, but that is going to zero very quickly. And they're either going to replace that or they're going to have a big hole in their budget. Power is happening slowly and at the pace of every windmill that we build, and then nuclear at some point comes and delivers big slugs of baseload, but that clearly appears to involve a lot more public involvement than had been initially hoped. What seems to be missing is any plan to deal with buildings and how we heat them, which is it is hard to believe that a household is going to be able to incur the expense of replacing their gas boiler with a heat pump to the tune of £7,000 to £10,000 a pop, without some kind of financial support from government either in the form of a loan or in the form of support. And so in the reports that we've done, we've kind of identified that as being the kind of unaddressed gap.
Yeah, and we've touched on that too. If you want to look at our reports on that about how we're achieving net zero, and there's a real assumption, you have a permanent secretary in front of you, we'll think this will be business as usual, people just get heat pumps. And we're saying, well, blocks of flat, this is built, we're pointing out all the real problems of doing that and the cost. It's interesting on electric vehicles as well. We did our very interesting session on that, and the little bit of money that you're given to go electric helps people like, I guess, I'm assuming us on a platform, well-paid people who might consider that the marginal difference will just tip them over. It's not going to help most of my constituents who couldn't afford to even keep their petrol car running for years and years and years.
And that is the kind of how do lower-income families, adjust to a net zero world is probably one of the biggest remaining questions. So just on the public sector productivity.
And I think there's something missing from the world which actually used to be around a while ago, which is some kind of public sector performance management framework with a set of targets what government is trying to achieve in different areas. And this did exist before. It was gotten rid of in 2010 and has been slowly replaced in different parts of the public sector in different ways, as I think governments have realised they can't escape accountability for the performance of public services because people just feel it. And also through people like Ed putting in freedom of information requests, you get information about what's happening to ambulance waiting times, survival rates in the NHS. But it's strangely patchy. It's not something which is consistently applied across public services. And I think it does make it really difficult to actually measure the general performance of public services. Because if you don't say what you're trying to achieve with a public service, how do you measure the efficiency with which you're achieving them? We clearly care about ambulance waiting times. We clearly care about survival rates in the NHS. But how do we measure the performance of the Department for Transport? How do we measure the performance of HMRC? Is it just in how much tax revenue they collect, or is it also in how they monitor compliance? Is it also in terms of how much it costs people to fill out a tax return? These things kind of exist in different patches around the place, and the PAC does a good job of trying to hold people to account for the information that you can get hold of.
But you can't get hold of it.
But you can't get hold of it.
Bad data is a big problem.
But even the data you can, get hold of, and we've looked at some stuff around health, and the variation in performance is stark. So actually there would be some, I'm not going to say quick wins, because nothing in health is a quick win, but there's certainly some obvious wins in trying to tackle that variation, where there are clearly areas that are performing well within budgets and areas that are not performing well within budgets, and we're not doing enough around focusing on that. And can I bring in on that public sector question?
Yeah, I did. So not that I would ever defend the government on this, but I kind of had the impression that when they were kind of gearing up towards whichever spending review it was, that was the end of austerity, and we were going to finally start to have spending reviews that weren't about retrenching but were about expansion. I think the Treasury did have kind of ideas about setting whatever kind of KPIs and targets, and there was going to be a grand plan, but of course then COVID came, and then there'd be various other kind of moments that have intervened. So I think that, I have the impression that there were things in the works, but things, life has got in the way, for better or for worse. Just kind of go back to some of the questions and hopefully kind of bring them together. And actually, so one other thing, Richard, so transport is kind of being solved. So electric cars are much more prevalent than they were before. But it's worth just noting that part of the reason that transport is being solved is because batteries are getting a lot cheaper, and part of the reason batteries are getting a lot cheaper is that a lot of them are made in China, and they're made in China, and is that the situation that we would want? Yeah. That's an enormous deal. China completely owns the entire battery supply chain, all the way to some extent from the stuff you get out of the ground, although a lot of that comes from Australia, but certainly the rest of it, making cathodes, making the materials that go into making the batteries themselves, and then to some extent making the cars as well. China is by far and away the biggest increase, has seen the biggest increase in their exports of cars of any country around the world over the course of the past few years. It's if there is a race, then they're winning it. So part of I think the issue with the government's approach is that it is entirely price focused, it seems to me, and it is not really focused on provenance. And Meg, we were talking a moment ago about kind of wind turbines and where they came from and what the kind of the issues there. We've got a lot to be proud of. We have the biggest offshore set of wind kind of generation in the world, and yet barely any of the content there is local content. It's not, we don't make the steel that goes into the towers. We make a little bit of the steel that goes into the nacelle. We don't make we make fiberglass in this country. We've got some amazing plants that make fiberglass, but most of it gets shipped off to other places, and we import fiberglass from China to go into the sails in our wind turbines. So there's a kind of, the extent to which we are interested just in price or interested in where stuff comes from is a really important thing, and I think goes back to your question, Greg, about is the government really serious about this? And my impression is no, I don't think they are getting more serious. But I think at the time that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, I think there was just a sense of, well, whatever. Isn't it great that America's now taking green stuff seriously? We've been taking it seriously for years. No, let's look at the subsidies. Let's look at the decision-making framework that you need if you were deciding whether to invest in the UK or invest in America. It's been the centre of gravity has completely changed, and that really matters. And back to both of your questions, where are we seeing the most hope and the most cause for interesting things happening on investment, particularly green stuff? It is in those kind of local areas. It's the mayors, it's the devolved regions. It's where decision making can be taken at those local levels, and people can corral businesses and local authorities into making stuff happen. Whether that actually delivers tangible kind of green investments, because there's a lot talked about Teesside and Ben Hatcham, but we've yet to see the tangible stuff and the results. But that is where the exciting stuff's happening right now, not in Whitehall, and that's no bad thing necessarily, is it?
Am I right thinking that West Midlands tried to do something around gigafactories?
They wanted it in Coventry, yeah,
which didn't work out.
Yeah, it is difficult because this is a massive scale commoditized thing, and basically the difficulty is that China is so far ahead. They're so far ahead that you need something enormous to try and persuade someone to come and build a good factory.
The cost difference is now going to be a problem for any government. Yeah. Whatever your principles, if you're suddenly ramping up, saying we'll buy British batteries, and the cost, the people aren't going to do it. That's.
And I don't think we could afford it like anything like the Inflation Reduction Act would be so extraordinarily expensive for a country like ours. So it's easy for me to kind of carp on the sidelines and say we need to do something.
But the irony is outside Europe, there's lots we could do.
Yeah.
But we're not by Europe rules now.
I want to just very briefly come back to Stuart's, because we have pretty much run out of time, but I'm going to do a kind of yes or no question before I do my very final question, which is, should we be breaking up the Treasury? Richard.
It's definitely not one for me. Other departments do more than one thing. Departments like DLUC have always been a tent under which 20 different things the government needs to do.
Would you say DLUC's been effective though?
I just think we have departments that, health and social care has been merged under a common umbrella. Departments are able to do more than one thing, but they have to prioritise and they have to multitask.
Yeah.
I've been in a treasury which is able to do those things, and I think it can continue to do it.
Okay.
I'd say broadly no, that's because I'm watching the money, but then I do like having accounting officers in departments going on to about the leadership point. We have people who don't have project management skills running things, so actually you need both the Treasury to understand project management better, but you need much better skill on that. I mean, one former minister said to me, I went in and all these gentlemen amateurs running major multi-billion-pound projects, there for 2.5 years or 18 months and off they go, and we've just got to start breaking away from that. But I don't think the machinery of government changes sound exciting, but I'm always really sceptical about them actually, because in the end you just move one team to another rock place and they're still doing the same thing.
Probably still in the same building, to be honest.
In fact, there are times you have teams sitting next to each other who are doing exactly the same thing and don't even know because they haven't spoken to each other. I mean, there are so the silo issue isn't necessarily about the Treasury, but also I think it's something about political leadership here. Yeah. That sense of place. Like I believe in place-based decision making. I started my career in neighbourhoods, around pushing distance. But that's I think what the two Andys have a very strong sense of the area that they cover. And they've got a big enough area, as the Mayor of London has, to make be unpopular in parts of their city or their city region, to make the right decision and make decisions. So a transport link will actually benefit a wider area, but it's difficult for one small borough to do. So I think there's a lot of it is about political leadership actually.
We haven't talked about planning yet.
And we can't because we've run out of
No,
time.
sorry.
No, that would be fabulous. We'll invite you back to talk about that.
Break it up. Break it up into two parts like the Germans. Done.
Okay.
Deal. Everything will be fine.
Perfect. And then by everything will be fine. I love that. I am also just going to put out there that we named the Department for Health and Social Care, and they've done nothing on social care whatsoever. Other than we looked in the budget. The only time social care is referred to is in the title of the department. Yeah. So just to mention that, but. Very, very fun questions. We have run out of time, so just literally sort of one or two word answers. The title of this event was the good, the bad, and the what next. I think we've kind of covered a lot of the what next. I want your good and your bad from the budget. I'm going to start with you, Ed.
Okay.
Best thing and worst thing.
I like full expensing. The bad, it's only for 3 years.
Okay, no, that's perfect.
The good, though with many caveats, is that they're talking about childcare. I'd say talk about early years education. You've got to fund it better. But the fact that this was a major point in a budget is actually a breakthrough, even though I think there's lots wrong with it.
Yeah.
The bad, just never let a chancellor go near pensions. We've seen the pensions allowance it's gone down thanks to George Osborne, it's gone up thanks to Jeremy Hunt, it's going to apparently go down because my party said we're going to axe it again. No, you can't have that. You've got to have certainty on pensions, so keep chancellors away from pensions.
Okay, and Richard?
I think the good was that it had a timetable and a deadline, and it was delivered according to that.
Low bar.
But that is an achievement. I think there's clearly it had some policies which tried to make some progress on a growth agenda, but as we've all discussed, there's more focus.
And the bad? I'm going to push you.
I think the bad was that it set itself a set of fiscal rules, and actually I think there was more smoke and mirrors than there was actually policies to get them closer to meeting their fiscal rules, and by which I mean kind of fantasy revenues that won't materialise, fantasy spending plans, and spending which they claimed they said were ambitions, but we weren't able to put numbers on because they don't have deadlines for them.
I love that. So we've renamed it the fantasy budget. Thank you so much, Richard, Megan, Ed. That was a fabulous canter through the budget, and I think we actually roamed much wider into the topics that we're really interested in. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. If we can just thank our panelists.